What's going on, guys? This is Rob, and we are back with Absolute Flash, the war of the Absolute Flashes, which is really more just Absolute Flash and Absolute Reverse Flash, but that's what the story's called. So, one of the things to know as we get into this, and a little bit of catch-up, because we've covered a lot of stuff, the long and short of this is that we now have Absolute Reverse Flash in the DC universe. And Absolute Reverse Flash is Eobard Thawne, but he looks almost subhuman, right? Kind of like a critter, right? He doesn't really look like a man anymore. But there is a motivation for him being here, and that does get revealed. But what this does is it opens up with Wally West, and he says, "Everything I was ever scared of, every bad I always knew deep down would one day happen, it is here. But I am not scared anymore, and I don't run away. I run toward it." Now, here's the cool thing about this. Symbolically, it's Wally West facing himself. Because if you kind of look at this comic for what it is, Absolute Reverse Flash represents every fear and every anxiety and every doubt that Wally West has. In effect, when Wally gained his powers, it was completely by accident, and it led to the death of Barry Allen, this thing that kind of haunted him throughout the entirety of his time in the Absolute Universe so far. But the reality is that having this power and not really knowing how it worked, not really knowing what to do with it, but simply just knowing that it was incredible and he was potentially dangerous, scared the hell out of him, right? And so Absolute Reverse Flash represents all of that, right? He's just kind of like this raging beast with an incredible level of power and represents everything that Wally West is afraid he would become. But the other part of this story is Gorilla Grodd, and that's what we switch over to. Now, it's not Grodd in the traditional sense, right? Gorilla Grodd, leader of Gorilla City and, telepathy and all that kind of stuff. He does have telepathic powers, but he's almost kind of benign in how he functions. And so what ends up happening is Gorilla Grodd comes across a scientist, just like fleeing for their life to get out of this place. Now, this scientist makes it out, right? But in fact refers to Grodd as a little bit of a freak. But Grodd, in looking up, realizes he needs a human handprint in order to access this door. And so when another scientist comes running along, Grodd dominates this guy's will with his power. Now, what's really interesting about this is that it's not necessarily like it is in the main DC universe, which is to say, depending on what era of comics we're talking about with Gorilla Grodd, and depending on who's writing his stories, sometimes him dominating the wills of others is total and absolute. They have no control over themselves. Other times, there is some measure of control, almost as if they're watching themselves commit an act, but helpless to stop themselves. In this particular instance, it's more akin to the latter, which is to say, this doctor understands what he's doing, doesn't want to do it, but cannot stop himself from doing it. But of course, it just leads to him opening the door. So fairly innocuous in a lot of ways, but it does lead to Gorilla Grodd finding his father. And that was really his mission here, right? Throughout all of this, is that Grodd and Wally kind of had a similar goal, which is to say they both wanted to find their fathers and they both wanted to save their fathers. It's the thing that united them. And it's very touching here, right? Because Grodd's father reaches out to him, right? And Grodd reaches out to his father and he just simply says, "Grodd not alone." And his father says the same thing, right? "Grodd not alone." And so at that point, we switch back over to the battle. Now keep in mind, right, Jessie, Trickster, she was basically a double agent working directly for Eleanor Thawne, the one that's basically overseeing all of this and the granddaughter of Eobard Thawne. Now, of course, where she had basically betrayed the rogues, who are essentially good guys in all of this, if we're being honest, she's kind of making up for it in small little ways. And one of them is by basically saving everyone's life by putting them inside of a force field using the various tech at her disposal. But in the midst of all of that, you have Rudy West, the father of Wally, who looks out and sees Wally there, standing in the midst of all this rubble. And the two embrace each other. And it's, again, a very touching moment here, because very similar to the pre-crisis version of Wally's father, Rudy in this instance is not nearly as reckless and silly. He's not like a manhunter acolyte, right? He's not running cons with people or different things like that. But he is not the most effective father there ever was. Again, the criminal elements aren't there, but he is kind of negligent in some ways and a little hard on Wally. But that's one of the things that he says. He says, "I'm sorry for everything, Wally. I should never have brought you here. I should never have trusted these people because he did trust them, right? He took them at their word in the sense that it was now a military operation essentially, and that Wally was going to be fine and Wally was going to be safe. Now, lest we forget, for the most part, it was a safe environment. It was Wally who listened to Barry Allen and snuck into the lab alongside Barry Allen, who let him in there recklessly. It was Wally who showed up in the middle of the experiment the second time he appeared, looking for Barry, going to places he knew he wasn't supposed to be. And it was that whole incident and that whole ordeal that led to Wally gaining his powers in the first place. But had he not been brought here by his father, it all would have been a zero sum. And that's really what his father is saying here, right? It's my fault any of this happened in the first place. I brought you here. I put you in this situation. You're young, you're reckless, right? Your job as a teenager is to do stupid stuff. My job as an adult and as your father is to make sure you're not put in positions that you end up doing stupid stuff, or at least to marginalize those as much as I can. But Wally just kind of bridges the gap here, right? And says, it's okay, right? Did you see what I did? And his father just says, I saw. You were and you are incredible, son. And again, it's a very touching moment. Unless you've been following our complete coverage of Absolute Flash, or you've been reading it on your own, you're really kind of lost on this, right? But the reality is that Wally's father was always so hard on him, and it was almost difficult to tell whether or not his father actually loved him, but he does. He cares about him. The problem is that in the midst of all this, Absolute Reverse Flash emerges from all this rubble and just addresses Wally directly, and Wally goes in for the fight. Now again, Absolute Reverse Flash here just says, only one. And that's all he's been saying the entire time, right? It's just some straight up Highlander stuff, right? There can be only one, right? But the thing about this is that there's a reason why he's saying this. And for those of you guys who called it before and said there can be only one, right? That he's talking about only one speedster out here in the world at the same time, you're actually right. And again, there's a whole motivation behind that. Now, of course, the rogues are kind of flabbergasted by everything. They have no real clue what's going on with all this madness. I mean, they kind of know, but they kind of don't. But Wally just tells his father, right? Like, I will take care of it and I will get him. Now, of course, his father being protective is like, no, I don't want you to. But Wally says, I have to, Dad. This is what I'm here for. And ultimately, he races off after Reverse Flash. Now, of course, in that moment, Rudy turns to the rogues and is like, okay, how mobile can you get us, right? Because I have an idea. And so where Wally is chasing after Thawne, notice this, Wally's not going in for the kill, right? He's not trying to destroy Eobard Thawne. He's trying to stop him and trying to understand him, right? He says, Thawne, stop. You're destroying everything. It's really more of a defensive response than an offensive response, which is to say, fighting to stop, not fighting to kill. And that's a very important distinction. Now, I would normally say this is clearly him being inspired by the actions of Superman and so on and so forth, but they haven't met yet. And while Superman is active out in the Absolute Universe, Wally West certainly doesn't know the kind of things he does and the kind of things that he gets up to. By and large, Wally's just kind of operating of his own volition. And so this is really just kind of one of those metatextual commentaries about how the nature of superheroes in the Absolute Universe kind of flies in the face of everything that Darkseid intended, right? Keep in mind, Darkseid created the Absolute Universe so superheroes were underdogs, but heroes are heroes. The people who become heroes have certain characteristics that lead them to engage in heroic efforts. That's the reason why Wally is the guy that he is, because he's trying to stop Thawne without killing him. And that's where Thawne just grabs him, right? And just says, there can be only one boy. And he says, I saw God. I saw him. He spoke to me in the darkness. He said, I was the one. I am Alpha and I am Omega. Now, of course, he's referring to Darkseid. And that's the other crazy thing about this, right? Is because Darkseid has been communicating with individuals within the Absolute Universe. The most direct example of this is the Absolute Legion of Superheroes, so much so that he actually brought them in to meet with him directly. For everyone else, it's largely just been indirect contact. The Martian Manhunter within the Martian Manhunter comic is aware of Darkseid, but as far as we know, he simply just observed him. They haven't actually really had any meaningful interactions. But Absolute Joker has become aware of Absolute Darkseid, even if only on some level, right? The nature of the universe itself. So it's all these small little things where Darkseid has kind of been manipulating the roles of these individual guys and bending them to his will in a variety of ways. When you add in the conclusion of DCKO and that epilogue that we covered, right, where basically every single universe across the multiverse has its own DCKO event, and Darkseid is effectively building an army in the same way that Superman is trying to do the same thing, it totally changes the dynamic of this, and it totally changes the perception of Absolute Reverse Flash and why he was transformed into the being that he is. Darkseid is rallying forces to his cause. Reverse Flash is just one of them. And so what you end up doing here is picking up with Captain Cold, who just fires off a freezing blast. Certainly not enough to destroy or even incapacitate Reverse Flash, but it is enough to distract him. And in that moment, the rest of the team joins in. And you end up finding out that what Jessie had done is she had rigged this kind of teleporter to the glider of Captain Boomerang. And that's where they just say, right, do it already, Jessie. And she just says, okay, but this clears the slate, right? I am making up for any wrongdoing. And when that happens, she activates a portal, and it's the portal to the still point, right? The source of all this power. Now, we still don't know exactly how it works. Even Barry explained they don't know exactly how it works. I still stand by the prevailing theory, which is that Absolute Reverse Flash is actually slowing things down instead of moving at super speed. The evidence will seem to indicate that it's actually moving at super speed. I just like the idea of the theory. But the fact is, right, the still point is the source of all this power, right? Speed Force energy within the Absolute Universe, and Reverse Flash starts getting pulled in. The problem is that it's not enough. Because of the speed he has at his disposal and moving away from the portal as fast as humanly possible, there's a better than fair chance that he is going to escape. And so what ends up happening is Rudy does the only thing he can do. He just says, I am sorry, Wally. I'm sorry I was not a better father. And Wally just asks him, right, like, what are you talking about? And Rudy just says, I love you, Wally, and goes to push Eobard Thawne through the portal and follows him in. And the portal immediately closes behind the two of them. Now, Wally starts freaking out, right? And he starts panicking, right? His father literally looks like he just died. And where he tells the rogues, right, like, reopen the portal. Open it now, right, so I can save my father. He's told by Captain Boomerang, we can't do that. We promised your dad we would close the portal behind him. We are not reopening that thing. And that's where Captain Cold just says, it's how it had to go. We can never let that thing get free again. Your dad knew that. And so it's kind of crazy because there's no confirmation here that his father's dead. His father's just stuck over there. And if there's any indication in terms of Wally West's time in the still point and how time passes in the real world, it's a very short period of time that passes in the real world relative to what happens in the still point. So I think there's a credible argument to be made here that Wally's father is going to come back with super speed. But he could very well be the Absolute Universe's version of like Johnny Quick, Jesse Quick, any of those guys, right? It would be pretty dope. Just see him to like bust out a mathematical proof and just start running at super speed. It would be pretty amazing. I would say this reality's version of Jay Garrick, but we already saw Jay, and Jay didn't survive. He was basically bones and dead inside the still point, which is what Wally is afraid of, right? When Jay was sucked in there, he died inside the still point. That same fate could await his father. And so that's why he simply just says he's not dead, right? It's Wally just refusing to believe it. And he says he's still alive in the still point. I just need to get back there, right? Trickster, can you rebuild Barry's equipment? And Trickster just tells him, right, I could talk to this stuff, I can't build it, right? And even Wally says, well, then what about Eleanor Thawne, right? But that's where Captain Cold just tells him, Eleanor's long gone, kid, right? She slipped away in the middle of it all. And he says, maybe we can track her down, right? And potentially use her to rebuild this whole thing. But Wally just says no, right? Like, you guys have done enough. And he says, I'm going to find my dad. I absolutely am. And he races off. Now, this is probably the most beautiful point in the whole story, because Wally says, I say it and I try to believe it. Then I just run. I get so tired, but I don't stop. I can't, because I know that when I do, it will catch up to me again. All that fear, all that anxiety that's been holding me down since I was a child. For a while there, I thought I outraced it. I thought that I had beaten it. But now there is no escaping it. So I let it hit me all at once. I let it back in. Now, let's kind of step aside from this comic book for a second. Let's have a little bit of real talk, right, in the real world. What's being referred to here by Jeff Lemire is what's called the inner child. Everyone has one. You have one, I have one, right? Different therapists call it different things, but effectively it's your subconscious, and it's informed by all the experiences you've had over the course of your life, both good and bad. So when people say you're acting in a way that's a defense mechanism, it's your inner child functioning in such a way that is trying to protect you from whatever the danger may be, right? Negativity bias exists, right? Two cavemen were walking along a path and they both heard rustling in the bushes. The one who ran away lived longer than the one who went to go investigate. And that's what you're getting here, right? The reality is that it's Wally West's inner child that's screaming, panicking, right? Falling apart over this idea that his entire life is nothing more than loss and pain, and he can't run from it. There's no way you can run from that. Carl Jung said it best. If you do not learn to understand your subconscious, it will dominate your life, and you will call it fate. And that's exactly what's been happening with Wally this whole time. So simply stopping and just allowing all that fear and all that anxiety to grip him and to take him over, it's not giving up. It's coming to terms with himself and accepting his own past, which is huge because it's the only way to move forward. And that's exactly what he does. He says, after a while, I get up again and I start walking and I realize where I had run to. I'm alone. I will always be alone now. I know that. Yet here I am. I am still alive and I know he is too. And I will never stop looking for him, right? And so what you end up doing is jumping to the first of two epilogues. Now, the first epilogue, right, is basically the Rogues, right? Where Jesse's just kind of like, like they come in your size, but I'm not sure about the color, right? So like new boots, new legs, right? But Captain Boomerang asked the question, right? So like, what now, right? What do we do? And Captain Cole just says, we load up this spare gear and then we get as far away from here as we can, Digger. As far as I'm concerned, we just became free agents, right? This is the Rogues will return. That's basically what this means, which I'm really excited about because while the Rogues have always held a special place in the Flash comics, that while there is this kind of unwritten rule between the Flash and the Rogues in the sense that Flash won't kill the Rogues won't kill the Flash, that kind of thing. It's almost kind of like a cat and mouse game. This is very different in a lot of ways. They're heroes trying to atone for past misdeeds. Hopefully they turn into something like the A-Team. But then you go into the second epilogue, which focuses on Grodd. And as they're walking along, Grodd asks his father, right, why did you stop? And his father says, I see more men. But that's where Grodd says, the bad men are gone. But his father says, no, Grodd, the bad men are not gone. All men are bad. All men pay. Now, this is important because what Gorilla Grodd is being taught by his father is that everyone out there is a bad guy, right? Essentially, it feeds into the idea human beings having disdain for other human beings is a learned behavior, not an inherent behavior. And that's what you're seeing here, right? It's a pretty iconic and somewhat unsettling bit of mythos for the character. But with that being said, guys, we're going to bring this to an end. Hopefully you guys enjoyed this video. If you did, drop a like. Again, not the most action-packed there ever was, but Jeff Lemire is nothing if not a master of character development. So I am very excited to see where this goes. But thank you all for watching, and I will catch you all later. Peace.